I'm Aaron David Miller, and this is Carnegie Connects. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are in the world. I truly hope you're sound, safe, and very healthy. I'm Aaron David Miller, Senior Fellow at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, and welcome to Carnegie Connects, a set of virtual, at least for now, conversations on issues of critical importance to America and to the world. Today, I'm thrilled, excited, and honored to be able to host the inestimable former Secretary of State, Madeleine K. Albright, in a conversation on American foreign policy, politics, and the future of the world. Madam Secretary, welcome to Carnegie Connects.
It's great to be with you, Aaron, and fun. A lot to talk about.
We sure do. But I have to ask you, I noticed when we were on together a minute or two that this morning or this afternoon, for some people, you're wearing the Dove pin. Could you provide a sort of condensed storyline on how this pin thing got started?
Well, what happened was, first of all, this dove was actually a present from Leah Rabin when you and I working together on Middle East peace. And when I gave one of my first Middle East speeches is when I wore it. But the story was that when I got to the United Nations, it was after the end of the Gulf War, and the ceasefire had been translated into a series of sanctions resolutions. And I was an instructed ambassador, and my job was to make sure that the sanctions stayed on. And so I said something pretty awful about Saddam Hussein practically every day, which he deserved. He'd invaded Kuwait. So all of a sudden, there was a poem that appeared in the papers in Baghdad comparing me to many things, but among them was an unparalleled serpent. So I happened to have a snake pin, and I started wearing it when we talked about Iraq. And so what happened, I think people know, at the end of a meeting in New York, there's a press gaggle, and all of a sudden I went out there and the press picked up that I was wearing the snake pin, and they asked me why. And I said, because Saddam Hussein compared me to an unparalleled serpent. And then I thought, well, this is fun. And I was in New York and certainly plenty of shopping. And I decided that I would buy a lot of costume jewelry that reflected what I thought we were going to do on any given day. So on good days, I wore flowers and butterflies and balloons. And on bad days, I wore a lot of carnivorous animals and spiders and things. And the other ambassadors, they talked about it. And they would say, what are we going to do today? And if you remember, the first President Bush had said, read my lips, no new taxes. So I said, read my pins. And that's how my whole kind of usage of pins to tell foreign policy stories came about. And there's been a collection that traveled around the presidential museums and various museums. And what is happening now is that you remember, Aaron, when we were at the UN and later at the State Department, there was the decision to build a diplomacy museum, which now abuts the main building. And I decided that I would give my pin collection to that museum because they really all have foreign policy stories and they tell a good story. So that's how the whole pin thing started.
It's wonderful. I'll put myself in the I support the Doves column pin. I want to get in, before we get to your tenure Secretary of State and talk about contemporary foreign policy and American politics, I want to get in briefly to what I call the backstory. That is to say, before you became a public figure, before you came to Washington, and you tell a wonderful story in your last book. You are at Heathrow, and a British customs official pulls you out of line. You're late, you're frustrated, and you say, do you know who I am? And the Brit answers back, no, but we have a number of very good doctors that could help you sort that out.
Yeah.
And I thought to myself, it's a good question. What were the seminal experiences of your early life that influenced your character, your sensibilities, your faith, and your priorities?
Well, it's something that we all try to figure out, but I have to tell you my story. I was born in Prague, Czechoslovakia, 2 years before World War II. And my father was a Czechoslovak diplomat. And we spent the war in England all through the Blitz. And my father was there working for the government in exile and with a number of responsibilities, but one was to broadcast over BBC into Czechoslovakia. Then the war ends. We go back to Prague briefly, and then my father is made the Czechoslovak ambassador to Yugoslavia. And I am 9, 10 years old. The little girl in the national costume that gives flowers at the airport is what I did for a living. And then we came to the United States once the communists took over. And my father had, as a diplomat, his assignment had been up, and his new assignment was to represent Czechoslovakia on a new commission to do with India and Pakistan over Kashmir. So I could go on, but I lived a life even before we came to the United States when I was 11, which was all about how one dealt with international problems, and a father who told a lot of stories and could explain the history of everything. And then we moved to Colorado, where my father taught at the University of Denver. I was the perfect daughter, and I did everything that he talked about and I thought about. And so this is how I grew up. And so it never occurred to me that I would have the kind of positions that I had. But I certainly spent my whole life thinking about history, cause and effect, the stories that develop, and the role of diplomacy.
Immigrant dimension of your early years, the fact that you moved so often and ultimately came to the United States. I suspect it's easy for you to relate, as you've described elsewhere, to new immigrants coming to this country.
Well, very much so. And I have to tell you, I obviously know their stories. And by the way, I didn't become a citizen until between my sophomore and junior year at Wellesley College in in the 80, excuse me. And so I identify with, and by the way, I hadn't focused on the fact until I was at, all of a sudden, some women from Boston came in, and Wellesley had this system that they announced thing over the loudspeaker, and they said, "Maddie Corbell, there are some ladies here who want to take you into Boston to show you what the American girl wears." And so I apparently I was viewed as a foreign student. But anyway, one of the things that I like to do most of all is to give people their naturalization certificates. And the first time I did it was July 4th, 2000 at Monticello. I figured since I had Thomas Jefferson's job, that was his home, and I could do that. And I'm giving this man his naturalization certificate. And as he walks away, he says, "Can you believe it? I'm a refugee, and I just got my naturalization certificate from the Secretary of State." And so I go and find him, and I said, "Can you believe that a refugee is Secretary of State?" And so, not long ago, I was asked to describe myself in 6 words. And I said, worried optimist, problem solver, grateful American. And I really do identify with those that come to this country because they can't live in safety or earn a living where they are. And the gratitude that I felt when we came here and of becoming an American citizen.
Those are great expressions in 6 words. You told one interviewer, and I was intrigued by this dichotomy, maybe not a dichotomy, that your personal mindset in the early years, or as you came of political age, was Munich, and yet your generation's identity was shaped by Vietnam. The former, you could argue, would tend to make you an interventionist, and the latter, Vietnam, might tend to make you risk-averse. So how do you still feel that way? How do you reconcile the two?
Well, the thing that really happened was, with my crazy story of how long it really took me to figure out what I was going to do, I was always 10 years older than all my colleagues that worked at the White House at the time that a lot of these things were happening. And Munich was my mindset. And the following thing that happened, it's always the word appeasement that is used with that. And being a Czechoslovak, there were always accusations that the Czechoslovaks didn't fight when the Nazis marched in March 1939. And there are people who blamed the then President Beneš for not really getting people to fight. And I remember having discussions with my father what would have happened if they actually, the Czechoslovak military had mobilized and fought back. So that is where I came from. The problem was different, which is that the people that I worked with are the ones that had the Vietnam syndrome, which was, let's not get involved in a quagmire. And I had initially a very different view about Vietnam because it was seen when it was happening, was that it was an anti-communist activity. And certainly one of the things, the fact that we had left Czechoslovakia was because of communism. And so I was a real anti-communist. And so I didn't fully understand the American reaction later to Vietnam in terms of a quagmire. So it was not that I changed my mind. It was basically that when I was arguing that we needed to take action on something, that the most of the people that I dealt with were part of the Vietnam generation. And I still was thinking as if I were of the Munich generation.
Well, we're going to come back to this tension between risk readiness on one hand and risk aversion on the other, because I think it really does confront the United States with a major challenge in defining its own role. But let's turn now to your tenure as Secretary of State. 4 extremely critical years, 1997 to 2001. We were literally in transition with the success of one war, the Cold War, for which we received enormous prestige and credibility, but we were about to transition in the wake of 9/11 to a couple of very hot wars. And the results there clearly with respect to Afghanistan and Iraq were mixed. But as you look back on those 4 years, how do you process the 1 or 2 things that you think we got right during those 4 years, and then perhaps the challenges or the things perhaps we got wrong?
Well, first of all, they were truly fascinating years because of the end of the Cold War and the kind of people that were really working together. And I had spent an earlier part of the 90s at the United Nations. I had, in fact, not only had the job of ambassador, but I was a cabinet member. And I was in a lot of meetings where there were discussions between 1993 and 1997 about what one should do, what was the role of the United States. And President Clinton was the first one to use the term indispensable about us. I just said it so often it became identified with me. But there's nothing about the word indispensable that says alone. It's just that we need to be engaged. And there was really a question about how much the U.S. should be engaged internationally. So given my background, I really did believe that the U.S. needed to act internationally. And by the way, also, in terms of things that go back in history, I was in the Carter administration as a staffer at the NSC, and that's when the Soviets invaded Afghanistan. So I had spent an awful lot of time with the issue of Afghanistan, and then also kind of thinking about something that had happened while at the UN, was that there were a number of what we call peacekeeping operations, where the US would work with others to try to deal with problems in other countries. So it was a decade where there was a lot of kind of seeing what America's post-Cold War world was going to be like, how we would work with others, how we would use the UN, how we would use regional organizations. So those were all the things that were going on. And I think it's important to understand that. The other thing, again, And I really do believe that one's background affects how one sees things. So one of the things that I think I'm very proud of that we did, having been a child when Europe was divided and the Iron Curtain came down, that there were all these countries. What were they going to do? What was going to be our relationship with them? And so one of the things I worked on was NATO expansion, that the Warsaw Pact, which had been the one that the satellites were a part of, the Soviet satellites, of how to bring those countries in Central and Eastern Europe into the system. And I think that was very important. There are those who disagree with it, but I think it was very important. And we were also trying to figure out how to actually work with a new Russia. How are we going to work with them and not see them as Cold War enemies, but also try to figure out what our relationships would be. And it's something that I worked on in a lot of different ways, but also very specifically. By the way, my whole life, there's so many accidents in it, which is that I spent a great deal of time both at the UN and as secretary looking at what we should do in the Balkans. And given the fact that my father had been ambassador to the former Yugoslavia, I knew all those the countries that ultimately became independent countries, the people, and how we worked with the Russians to try to be able to figure out something that could be done positively together. So the various pieces of my life came together, but those are the things I worked on. And I do think there was this great sense of optimism about operating in a different environment.
Right. You are, though, an optimist. And you once said to me, you are an optimist who worries a lot. And we're going to get back into a minute about the things that you worry about. But 3 quick questions. Your best day as the 64th Secretary of State of the United States of America?
Well, my best day actually goes back to the Balkans, which is that after the war in Kosovo was over, I went to Pristina, the capital, and a lot of people, the square was just jammed with people. And there were signs everywhere. Thank you, USA. Thank you, USA. And it was a joyous crowd, and it was really something to celebrate. And by the way, the 20th anniversary of that time was not long ago in 2019. And I went with President Clinton back to Pristina, and I have never seen again so many American flags or people with signs about their gratitude to us, and walking through the main square, the main town, and the stairs, holding hands with President Clinton. We went to look, they just put in a statue of me, a bust. Fortunately, it's on a pedestal, so I look taller. And then we went to see this very large statue of President Clinton. But it really was something that made me and him very proud that we had taken action. So that was my best day as Secretary of State, I have to say, being there in the capital of Kosovo.
And the worst day?
Well, the worst day is very easy to identify. And it was August 7th, 1998, when our embassies in Kenya and Tanzania were blown up. And lives were lost, American lives, as well as those of people in Kenya and in Tanzania. And in a couple of days later, I went there, and it was just stunning. And it really had a very big influence on how we carried out diplomacy later. And then I brought the bodies home, and it really, there's no question. There then were issues about why it had happened, and it became clear that Osama bin Laden was responsible, and by then he had moved to Afghanistan. But there's no question that it was the worst day.
You know, you tell a wonderful story about that flight back with those 10 coffins. You were on a C-17, you couldn't sleep. In the middle of the night, you pulled the curtain back, which separated the passengers from the 10 dead Americans. And you related how you spent some time with them and said a prayer. But then you talked about accountability, which is, to me, very important. I've spent the last 20 plus years looking back on what we did right and particularly on what we did wrong. I was just wondering, and I think you suggested a certain amount of personal accountability. How could you not? What is your view of accountability with respect to officials in government?
Well, first of all, it's the prime duty. You are, especially in a democracy, to be accountable and take responsibility for what you do, but then also if you've done something wrong. And as Secretary of State, one is the chief diplomat, but you are responsible for all the other diplomats that are stationed abroad in difficult circumstances. I can explain what happened because, and you certainly understand how the State Department worked, but theoretically, there was some information that something like this was going to happen, but it never reached me. And again, I think this is something you really would understand, is that there was my deputy was doing something else very important in terms of his responsibilities. But the people that made decisions about what was going on at the time was the Undersecretary for Political Affairs and the Undersecretary for Management. And the Undersecretary for Political Affairs wants to keep embassies open, and the Undersecretary for Management wants to close them up for different reasons. And so the decision never got to somebody that was able to kind of pull those two different channels within the State Department. So after all this happened, there was one of those committees that tried to figure out what had happened. Yeah. And I was held responsible. I had to be accountable for it. The thing that happened, though, as a result of that, it was decided that somebody had to be able, at the top, to be able to bring those channels together. And I was told I had to do it. And so every day after that, the security people would come in and say, today we saw an unidentified Vespa in front of our embassy in Athens. Or there was somebody in a Latin American embassy who had come in and delivered some package that nobody understood. The bottom line is, I don't think I had the knowledge or the expertise to identify, how to handle all that. But one of the things was that I decided we had to do different things in our embassies. And one of them, our embassies are supposed to be the eyes and ears of our country in whatever foreign country, which means that you are open and there's a library and you want people to come. And what had happened in Nairobi, our embassy was downtown with glass covering most of the front. And it was literally a sitting duck. And so one of the things that happened as a result of this investigation was that we had to begin to move our embassies out of town. And our embassy in Kenya now is way out, very hard for people to reach. Those people in our embassies that used to be called Foreign Service Nationals, they're now have a different acronym, had trouble getting there. All kinds of things happened as a result of it, and how our embassies look different. Yeah. I also got very criticized for the fact that we put Jersey barriers around the State Department. And something I will never forget, even though I was out of office on 9/11, I watched the second plane hit. And for reasons that are unclear to me, I decided to go to my office downtown that had nothing to do with the government. And as I'm listening to the radio, they say the Pentagon has just been hit. And I thought, and they said there's a threat against the State Department. And I thought, thank God I put those Jersey barriers up. But it was a really hard time. I did feel accountable. I followed through, but then the question was, now what? But it really was the accountability part is essential.
And I agree. You told the New York Times at one point that even though you were no longer Secretary of State, when you read or heard about some breaking development, your instinct was to game it out as if you still could shape and influence U.S. policy. So let's play a kind of quick lightning round. We don't have time to go into great detail, but I'll throw out a, and there are many. I wish there were more opportunities. I'll throw out a potential problem, crisis point, and maybe say a word or two of how you deal with it. Russia and Vladimir Putin. You were the first senior American official, if I'm not mistaken, to meet with Putin. I'm pretty sure that's correct.
Yep.
So Russia.
Well, I think we have to recognize that we are dealing with a former KGB agent, and that he is using technical expertise and cyber in a way that we had not expected or knew enough about. And I think that we don't want to be enemies with Russia, but I think we need to be open-eyed in terms of how we deal with him. And so I definitely would have and was critical of the way the previous administration had cozied up to Putin, because Putin is trying to separate us from our allies and undermine our democratic system.
Okay, the challenge of every day, it seems, the biggest foreign policy issue in town and elsewhere, China.
Well, I spent a lot of time on China when I was in office, and I have since. And I think we need to recognize that they are our major challenge, and how we deal with it through the tools that we have. I teach a course on the National Security Toolbox. And I think what needs to happen is that we need to be more sophisticated about how we deal with them. We can't just decide that they are the enemy. And I think one of the ways that the administration now is thinking about it is that there's some areas where we have to cooperate, which is on climate change and health issues. Another where we have to compete, and we compete with a lot of countries in terms of our economic, the way we trade and the number of things that we do. And then they are an adversary in terms of their behavior with what they're doing in the South China Sea and their most recent threatening kinds of things that they're doing around Taiwan. And that as a diplomat, you have to be able to compartmentalize, but we have to deal with China. We can't just decide that we will, disappear. The thing that was interesting was the thing that President Obama did was to decide to pivot towards China. That made our European friends very nervous. But I have said the U.S. Is not monogamous. We're an Atlantic and a Pacific power, and we belong there, and we have to recognize. So I'm watching very carefully the way that our China policy is being laid out.
Yeah. Okay, North Korea. You have a special interest here. You went to Pyongyang in October of 2000, I believe, with the intention maybe of planning a presidential visit, which never materialized. North Korea is a nuclear weapons state, acknowledged or recognized or otherwise. What do we do about North Korea?
Well, we have to understand the threat that they are. And by the way, very specifically in terms of putting myself into another secretary's shoes, what happened was when I came back, that was, by the way, the year of the disputed election. And the Supreme Court decided that Bush was going to be president. And I went, when I came back from my trip, to brief Colin Powell, who became Secretary of State. And what was interesting was that initially he was going to follow through on the kinds of things that we were doing. And then there was a headline in the Washington Post that said Powell to continue Clinton policies. And he was hauled into the Oval Office and told no way. So that was one time that I could put myself into another secretary's, reading what he had to do. But I do think that we have to deal with North Korea in some form. And we are now watching the kinds of things that the South Koreans are doing in terms of having relationships across the DMZ and trying to figure it out. But we can't just stand by and watch as the North Koreans are launching more now very dangerous kinds of missiles and what their plans are. And so I believe that it is not a sign of weakness to have talks and try to figure out how we deal with what I think is a very, very serious threat in terms of where Kim Jong-un is dealing. So I do think that's something I hope that this administration picks up in a lot of the pieces that are there, because when they're isolated, it doesn't help anybody.
I do want to turn to domestic politics, but I want to ask you at least one more question about an issue that I know is close to your heart, and that is democracy promotion. Our mutual friend, Mike Abramowitz from Freedom House, recently said that 2020 marked the lowest number of free countries and the highest number of not free countries since 2005. Less than 20% of the global population now lives in a free country. And we, in part, live in our own glass house. So can you comment briefly on how you think we need to approach the democracy issue? Do we divide the world, as President Biden has done, into, or the struggle for the 21st century, into democracies and authoritarian powers? How do you conceptualize this?
Well, first of all, let me say that I have just written a paper on the truth is that actually democracy is having a revival in places, and we can talk more about that. But democracy is not dead. Michael and I have done a lot of things together, but I really do think this is the optimist part, that there are things, the pendulum is swinging. But the thing that I have believed, and this again goes to my background, that America is the model in so many ways of democracy, and that we are all the same, that we want to, around the world, that we want to be able to make decisions about our lives. Actually, President Reagan, who was in London in 1983-84, and he gave a speech in Parliament in which he said that Americans were not really describing democracy well in comparison to communism. And he came back and he started the Endowment for Democracy that has 4 institutes: Democrats and Republicans, business and labor, kind of the warp and woof. And I have spent my time with the National Democratic Institute ever since then, except for the time I had a couple of other jobs. And so I think democracy cannot be imposed. That's an oxymoron, but it can be supported. And I think that we are better off when there are other democracies. What I think is very important to think about now is that division that you're talking about, authoritarian versus democracies. I did write a book with a scary title, Fascism, a Warning. And I have been concerned about the divisions that are created as a result of that kind of authoritarian government. And the first fascist was Mussolini. And he was Italy was in feeling disrespected because they hadn't gotten enough credit for what they'd done during World War I. The economy was bad. He was an outsider, and he took advantage of being a good speaker. And by the way, the best quote in that book is from Mussolini. It says, "If you pluck a chicken one feather at a time, nobody notices." So there have been a lot of feathers that have been plucked in the United States. And I am concerned about what is the basis of the fascist theory, which is a leader who identifies himself, and by the way, most of them are hymns, with one group at the expense of another that then becomes the scapegoat. And that is the kind of thing that I've been watching and troubles me deeply about the divisions in the United States at the moment. And then just to end this is, I was in Egypt actually at a certain point talking to an Egyptian member of parliament, and as part of an NDI grouping there. And I said, the thing you need to do is to create coalitions and compromise. And this member of parliament looked at me and said, "You mean like you guys?" So at the moment, we have not been a great example of this. And I do think that we need to recognize that we're the world's oldest democracies. And as President Biden says, it's not the example of our power, but the power of our example that is important.
I want to get to this question in the last 10 minutes that remain, because I think it is the central challenge facing the United States. In fact, I think, and again, I've spent my entire life in foreign policy, but I truly believe that there is no single foreign policy issue out there, perhaps with the exception of climate, that represents a greater danger or threat to the future of this republic than the 3 or 4 crises that the American experiment confronts today. Truman once said about Nixon that he may have read the Constitution, but he never understood it. And my question to you is, Bob Kagan argued, one of our mutual friends, argued that we are already in a constitutional crisis. How worried are you, having written a book about fascism, to pose the old question, title of more than one movie or one play or one book, could something like that happen here? Both Mussolini and Hitler used constitutional means to gain power. And plucking the chicken one feather at a time is precisely, it seems to me, the avenue that some would like to take. How worried are you about the nature of our system, electoral integrity, and the like?
Well, this is where, when I say I'm an optimist who worries a lot, this is what I worry about. Because I am surprised at some of the actions that have taken place. Obviously, January 6th being the prime one, but also kind of watching some of the intramural stuff that is going on, of not recognizing what the problems are, how we work, the elections are not or democracy is not a spectator sport. It really takes people to participate, to vote, and our voting system is being now questioned. I have less questions than I am very concerned about what has happened in terms of the way information comes about at this point. Democracies need information and the truth. And what has been happening in terms of where people, if you remember, you can have alternative opinions, but not alternative facts. And that is one of the things that really worries me now. I am worried about how the Constitution is being interpreted by some for their own purposes. And so I am following very carefully the committees that have been set up on the Hill. And I do think that we need to really look at what the role of technology is in terms of the distribution of algorithms rather than facts or the various things that are going on. And I'm going to speak out about all this. I was asked at certain points during the book whether I thought Trump was a fascist. I said I didn't think so, but I thought he was the least democratic president that we've had in a long time. And I really do think that we all cannot become victims of the big lie, that what we have to do is understand that our freedom is one, that we have to be able to ask questions of each other, and to ask questions about what direction we're going in and not be afraid to do that. And, various quotes from Ben Franklin and others, a republic if they can keep it. And so I think that we are in a very complex time, but information and the public's questioning and recognizing that it is our responsibility to ask questions, that it is not unconstitutional to ask questions, and to really be vigilant about what is going on. I think, and then the main thing, Aaron, that I have believed in is that it's essential to talk with people with whom you disagree. I don't like the word tolerance because that actually means tolerate, put up with. I think we need to have conversations where we listen and respect the views of those with whom we disagree and try to figure out to find solutions.
You know, I mean, you touched on a critically important point. Men and women who come to Washington to serve in government are ambitious. Our three undeniably greatest presidents, Washington, Lincoln, and FDR, were all ambitious, extraordinarily so. And yet their ambition was tethered and tied to a set of broader objectives and goals, which had as its essence the future and success of the American experiment over which they're presiding. You're being diplomatic and I think, and perhaps overly generous in your description of the former president, but the inability to turn the M in W upside down so it becomes a W in we is critically important to the success of the leaders. And frankly, I've voted for Democrats and I've voted for Republicans. I've worked for Democrats. I've worked for Republicans. The Republican Party, it's not a question of has person X left the Republican Party. The Republican Party has left any sense of what I would consider to be some of its more redemptive qualities and characteristics. Seems to be gone. And we're now dealing in an extremely dangerous situation. I know you recognize that, which brings me, I think, to my final question. I know you do not like to be asked, how do you want to be remembered? I think you told the New York Times, I'm still here. Why do I want to talk about how I want to be remembered? But what is the most important thing that Madeleine Albright should be focusing her time on now?
Well, I really, those 6 words is how I would like to be remembered. A worried optimist, problem solver, and grateful American. And there is no way to describe fully my gratitude to having been able to come to this country and to be able to work on things that I think didn't just make a difference for me, but mostly that I wanted to work for others, with others, and that for democracy. And I do think, by the way, what is interesting, ambitious is viewed as a bad word. I don't think it's bad to be ambitious, that you really do have to dedicate yourself to something. And so I really do hope that I am thought of as somebody who will always be grateful for coming to this country, but it is not something that happens automatically, and that you have to try to figure out how to deal with what are very serious issues in terms of what is happening and speak out, and then do spend time listening and talking with people with whom you disagree, because a difference of views is not a threat. It is when you stop listening and stop talking to those and start thinking that you're above the law. The law and information is absolutely what needs to happen for a democracy to flourish. And so I'm going to keep talking about the importance of America being the city on the hill, but it also means that we have to be very conscious of our errors and do everything we can together to try to resolve the problems, because we are the indispensable nation with partners. That is the part that's so important.
Madam Secretary, you have no doubt that you have done an extraordinary amount for this country. Your selflessness, your willingness to sacrifice and to serve is quite remarkable. And I wish you continued good health and success. If we had more time, you're wearing the dove today. I know I've avoided talking about our favorite subject. We spent many days and nights at various summits over the course of those 4 years, pursuing what you call in your memoir a fruitless quest, at least for the moment, for sure. I've given up most of my illusions on this subject, but one thing I have not given up, to quote Elie Wiesel, is hope. And neither of you, because without hope, frankly, there is no life. So I
have to admit, Aaron, that there are problems, that the United States has made some mistakes, and that we have to deal with them. But I do think that Elie Wiesel is a very good example of somebody who really fought back and developed bridges and tried to solve problems. And so we have to be problem solvers, and we have to make sure that we do not deny when there are terrible things that happen, because otherwise we will not be in a position to help solve them. So thank you very much. I, as always, enjoyed having a conversation with you.
Madam Secretary, thanks so much. And I want to thank everybody for tuning in. Next week, October 13th, I'll be sitting down with Rob Malley, our U.S. envoy to Iran, to talk about the future of the U.S.-Iranian relations. Once again, Madam Secretary, thank you so much for coming on Carnegie Connects.
Thank you for all you're doing now. Thanks.
Take care. Thank you for listening to Carnegie Connects, a production of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. Views expressed are those of the host and guest panelists, and not necessarily those of the Carnegie Endowment, which takes no institutional positions on public policy issues. Subscribe to Carnegie Connects on popular platforms such as Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, or your favorite podcast platform. Like what you heard today? Learn more at carnegieendowment.org/Carnegie Connects. Tim Martin is our audio engineer, and Catherine Buchanan and Cliff Jayapranada are our executive producers. I'm Aaron David Miller, and until next time, think positive and test negative.